Welcome back to our second season of the Exhorter podcast, where it is our aim to stir up love and good works through bite-sized biblical discussion. Paul, what's our topic for this episode?
John, Kyle, good to see you both. So we're going to talk a little bit about church attendance. Is it necessary? What happens when we're not doing it? And I'm going to begin with a really corny preacher story that was used in a sermon, okay? So the story is told of a preacher who was conducting a funeral service for church members who failed to attend the assemblies of the church. He reasoned that since they were not alive and active, they must be dead, and therefore they must have the benefit of a funeral. So he placed the names of several, quote, dead members on a small artificial casket. The funeral was held on Sunday evening. Here's some of the names that he put on the caskets. It was Miss Lotta Services, Isla Come Back Someday, Dan Rather Be Elsewhere, Fill My Pew, former, I Wanna Stay Home. There was Mr. I Be Bored. There was I Am Lukewarm, and I'm in a Bad Mood. It's funny when you read it because they have to look like names, but obviously there was no funeral. But I guess the question might be, if you're listening to this, where are you in that? And he was trying to make a point that a lot of times when you look at a church, one of the first signs of decline of either an individual Christian or of a church is attendance. And we like to say, as one of the shepherds here of this church, it's not just about the numbers, yet a lot of times we're looking at the numbers to see, well, how many were here Sunday morning? I will tell you, if my girls are listening to this, they hate almost every Bible class. My question is not just about their Bible class, but I ask them how many were there, because I'm curious what the numbers are like. Hey, how many people were there? And oftentimes, and Kyle, you were alluding to this earlier, we were talking, as a teacher, as a preacher, or as a shepherd, when you see a large crowd, it motivates you. You're more excited. You see that, okay, there's a full room and all the work that I put in, I see people who are engaged to be here. But when you don't, it has the opposite effect of those around. And so I want to talk a little bit about church attendance. Number one, is it necessary? Number two, when you're not here, what may be happening and what may be causing it as well. And so with that, Kyle, I want to turn to you. You are one of the main preachers here in our congregation, and we don't often talk about the other side. What is it? We know what it's like sitting in the pews, but when you're standing up front and you see the impact of members who are not here, do you notice? And what's the impact of you standing up there preaching or teaching?
Yeah, it can be a little bit deflating. And you always have this mindset as a preacher, what's a good Sunday morning sermon versus a Sunday evening sermon? And you kind of preaching to two different churches. So what I might preach, I might put a sermon together and say, now that's more of a Sunday night sermon, because I'm just anticipating a thinner crowd and even a different kind of crowd Sunday night. But and even gospel meetings, I'm kind of a fan of doing a gospel meeting that finishes on a Sunday myself, because a lot of times I've been at meetings where Sunday you get the most people Sunday morning, and that's the high point, and it only goes down from there. Can feel a little discouraging to finish with half the people you started with at the gospel meeting.
I never thought about that. It's a good point. I'm going to guess, we're talking and you try to beat every service and you look at that, but we read in the Psalms, a psalm that we've read a lot, Psalm 122 and verse 1, that says, I was glad when they said to me, let us go to the house of the Lord. If someone's not attending, maybe one question might be, what is at the root cause? And I want to remove for a moment the obvious things. If you're dealing with a physical ailment of some sort that prevents you from getting out, that's not what we're talking about. But I will say, it seems to me every time I look over and I see Paul Thompson or others who are doing whatever they can to be there, and I know they probably don't feel 100%, but they don't want to miss a service, that can become a crutch to keep you away. But let's assume you've got a physical ailment that is really keeping you. Remove that for a moment. What are other reasons that you think people are not attending as they should?
I think there's only two reasons you don't show up. You are hindered or you neglected. So if you're hindered, maybe then there's a list of, people who are sick or people who, have reasons to. But then you still need to go through those reasons and see if those reasons are reason enough to not come and worship God. I mean, a lot of times we put some of these reasonings of, the congregation, they're just not kind to me, or no one reaches out to me, or you're putting all these other reasons in front of the fact that what do we do in worship? We're worshiping God. We're coming here to do something for our God in heaven. And a lot of times we let our personal relationships with people in the congregation get between this sovereign opportunity and need to give God our worship, to show him that we love him. And it just frustrates me when people put too many things in front of that. Search yourself, search your heart. Are you being hindered from coming, or are you finding a reason and neglecting being here?
So, John, you hit on something interesting. And I think if I hear you correctly, I mean, you can look at the scriptures and we know that we need to be here to worship God. But what you're saying is that a lot of times people are focused in on a disagreement, a family issue, an issue between members. And when they think of worshiping at church, they're not thinking at that moment about God when they come to worship on a Sunday morning at the Clovis Church of Christ. They're thinking about, there's that brother or sister who wronged me and I'm upset with them, or I'm really not happy with the decision that the elders made, or, there's this thing that I just don't like and I'm upset about that. Therefore, I'm going to stay home. So it's the relationships and the people that sometimes can be the hindrance rather than the focus on, hey, I'm here to worship God. Nothing will distract me from that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, in all his wisdom and power, he understands what we get from it. He understands how beneficial it is for us to build relationships and to come here and to exhort one another. He understands that. But first and foremost, coming here isn't about us. It's about God. And it's pretty selfish of us sometimes to be thinking about how long the sermon is, or whether who's song leading today, or all these different things that get in the way of our worship that we are presenting up to God. Some days it's really harder to sit and focus, and maybe you're exhausted, or you worked the night before, or there's lots of reasons why it can be difficult. But that's what sacrifice is. That's what love is. Putting someone else before you.
Well, who's actually questioning the length of the sermons anyway? That's not a realistic example.
I'm not saying.
But I think what you're talking about, though, is duty, responsibility, obligation. And that's where I can speak as a preacher.
You mean because you have to be here?
Exactly. And it's hard for me to talk about this without sounding like I'm being self-serving here or putting myself up on a pedestal, because I'm not. But I do that as my perspective. And I don't get the option of, I don't feel like it, so I don't want to go. I don't get that option. And almost every time, though, and yes, even as a preacher, there are Sundays where I'm not in the right mood or mindset, where there is a part of me that says, I don't want to go today. That happens to me. I go because I feel that I have to. I feel that obligation, that responsibility, that duty. And almost every single time I come away from the experience encouraged and in a better mindset than when I started. But I had to make myself go because I knew it's what I needed to do. Now, I've got other considerations as a preacher that factor in there, but I've wished that people could experience it from my perspective as well and feel, just take that option off the table of not wanting to go. Just take that off the table and go anyway.
Well, I mean, we do that all the time. If you work for a large organization, there's only so much work you can miss. So, I mean, in some cases, we all know what it's like, Kyle, to have to be somewhere, not be given really an opportunity to say, I just don't want to.
I hear
mean,
people
who
complain
says that?
about.
I don't want to go.
I hear people complain about Monday mornings all the time, and I don't get it because that's my day off.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, that's the thing is there's some things that are non-starters for us where we wouldn't ever challenge not going into work, or missing work 10% of the time. We wouldn't have a job. What's the priority and focus in your life at that point? And honestly, I'll say that I've known many service workers who had to work on Sundays. A lot of people who work in public service, you go through shifts and you go through those things. And I've known some really strong, diligent people who do that for a time. But what they do is their goal is to work up and out of those situations because they do have a priority. And so work, I know, can be one of those things. But what is your goal? Is the goal to move to a different shift or a different position or a different place where you can be with the saints on Sunday morning? I hope it is, because that's what we need to do. Sometimes you're hindered in a certain profession, but then as we talk in the high school classes, we try to get the kids to understand and look at those professions that might hinder you from attending regularly and take that into consideration. Be smart about that. And if you do go down that avenue, focus on what you need to do to be with the saints.
I think the sense of duty you both talked to is important. And if you are in any position of responsibility, and I don't just mean in the church, if you are a husband, you've got a responsibility of leadership to your wife. And so if how you are responding to these things, how you are leading, you need to be thinking about more than yourself. If you are a parent and you've got children, you need to be thinking about how your lack of attendance affects your children or your grandchildren. And so to me, that sense of duty has gone beyond a position in the church, but just in my family, that's been there. But I would also say to those who may be not attending for some of the reasons that we said, there's issues with, it may be I'm focused on a disagreement with a brother or sister, but I'm going to call it another thing that is happening in a lot of our churches. And some would say our congregation is larger than others, probably medium sized compared to a lot of churches when it comes to the number of people here. But in a church our size, I've heard it said that you can be amongst a lot of people and feel completely alone. And I have talked to members of our own congregation who, if you've ever feel like you walk into a body of believers and yet you feel completely alone, that's another problem there. Not just how you feel, even though you're there to focus on God. One of the benefits we read about in the scriptures, I mean, if you open up the beginning of the church in Acts 2 and you read about it, from the day of Pentecost forward, it talks about them being together and having all things in common. And they clearly had a relationship that was different. It later, Acts 4:31, they met, they prayed together. There was clearly a powerful relationship there. So I think another element that sometimes happens is people come, and I think it's especially prevalent if we have common interests. You come to church, and those of us that play fantasy football, we may go talk about that. Those who have an interest in something else go talk about something else. But we have little cliques of families, interests, people we've known for a longer time, people we would relate to better. But in the middle of that, we've got a lot of people who I think sometimes feel alone. And I do feel as a congregation, one thing that we all need to work on is being more intentional, being more diligent about our interaction with everyone, not just the people that we're typically talking to, but those we never talk to, because I do think that contributes to a lack of attendance. And I'm not excusing lack of attendance, but if you're listening to this and maybe you're one of those who has felt alone and maybe that's been an excuse, I would encourage you also to be one of those that takes the initiative. Ask someone to go to coffee, to lunch, interact with people more than just in the aisle for 5 minutes at church, because the relationships we build here, I believe, contributes directly to the feeling we may have beyond duty to want to be together as a body of Christians.
Well, and that's where the sense of obligation or duty mixed or opposite the desire to be here. That's how they work together. Because we talked about times that you might come here on a Sunday or go to worship when you don't feel like it. And that shouldn't characterize your day-to-day life as a Christian. That shouldn't be the norm, to just feel duty, responsibility, obligation, and go even though you don't feel like it. I would hope that's not the norm for people. But there are times when you are going to feel like that, like not feel like you want to go, and you need to make yourself go. But the hope is that we see the other side of that coin. There have also been times in my life of great stress, troubles, hardship happens, something really bothers me, and all I want is to go and be with my brethren, to go be with the church. And so I've seen the exact opposite, the extreme opposite of that, where all I want is to be with my fellow Christians. But you don't get there unless you struggle through some of the times where you don't want to be there and you make yourself go. I think that's how you get to the point where in those, you see that transformation to where now in your troubled times, you want to be there because you've made the effort, made the commitment. And that's how it works in a marriage. Sometimes in a marriage, I've been married almost 20 years now, and sometimes it takes commitment. Just, I'm going to work through whatever issues we have. We're going to, I'm not feeling it right now, but we're committed. We're going to work through this. But that shouldn't be the norm for a marriage, just commitment. But I look at it as a good litmus test.
It is. Well, it's the eye test. It's
in Jeremiah chapter 17, I won't read too much of the text, but historically, we are right at the very end, just within a few years of Jerusalem being destroyed. And this is God's last effort through the prophet Jeremiah to get some correction. And he says in Jeremiah 17, beginning in verse 19, he tells Jeremiah, go into the city of Jerusalem and shout it to the kings, the princes, and all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and tell them to observe the Sabbath, to stop working on the Sabbath. And why is that so important? God says in verse 24 that it shall be if you heed me carefully, if you respect and hallow the Sabbath and stop working like you're supposed to. It says kings and princes will enter in here. And he says at the end of verse 25 that this city shall remain forever. Okay, there's lots of other things they need to be doing, right? There's other commands in the law of Moses that are important. Why is the Sabbath identified? I think similar to the idea of, to use our modern vernacular, going to church every Sunday. I think observing the Sabbath was their litmus test. That if you won't keep the Sabbath, you're probably not going to keep many of the other commandments.
If it's base level, right?
And maybe that's kind of the comparison here with being with the church on the Lord's Day is if you're not committed to that, maybe there's some other things lacking in your life. There's a deeper lack of commitment that's there. This is a good litmus test.
Yeah, we've gone through that too, about how much time are you really setting aside by just being here on Sunday and Sunday morning, Sunday evening, Wednesday night. The amount of time, if you're not willing to give 4 hours of your entire week, let alone per day, thinking about and worshiping God, it is definitely a litmus test or a measurement of how engaged you are in worship.
I do want to say during the pandemic, that time we had a lot of people and even our own congregations that we had a time where we were streaming. And then as we slowly came back, there was some that were streaming longer. And even today, there's some that are streaming. And those who are streaming, if there's those who literally physically cannot be here, that's one thing. But one thing that we as an eldership have talked a lot about, streaming is no replacement for assembling. They are two different things. And so if someone is at home watching, that's one thing if they're being edified. But that is not in any way, shape, or form a replacement for coming to worship God. That is not in any way, shape, or form helping you to be there for your brothers and sisters. Faith is a team sport. And so when you're not here, you're also impacting other people by not being there for them, by not even interacting with other people. This is as a body of believers, we need to be interacting with one another. And so if you're sitting at home streaming, and you could be here, that's the group I'm talking about. You could be here, but you're not. You're streaming at home. You're not worshiping God the way the New Testament tells us to worship. You cannot sit at home and stream if you can be here. You're not able to encourage others. You're not able to participate in the same way. Now, I would find 9 times out of 10, those not attending are not streaming. They're not. There's other reasons they're not doing it. But if you're not doing any of those things, you're not getting the instruction, you're not getting the teaching. And Kyle, you alluded to how you feel. There's times that whether it be a midweek Wednesday night Bible study, and I know we're talking about Sunday morning, but I'm going to call out Wednesday night Bible study. Our attendance has been a little bit down. If you're listening to this and you're not there, number one, you're missing out. Number two, we call it an opportunity to recharge, to get refocused on spiritual things. We would encourage you, take advantage of those opportunities. Because remember, it's not just about you. It's about the people around you. It's about how do you know how your brother and sister is doing. If you're not there, you're not part of that, and you're missed.
I'll add number 3. We are missing out. When you're not here, we're missing out on your presence. You bring something to the table when you come and participate in Bible class, when you ask questions, when you raise your voice and lift your voice in praise with ours as we sing. We're missing you, and that's an important consideration as well.
So I've heard this phrase before, there with you in spirit, right? We've all heard someone say, or I'm there with you in spirit, or
wasn't that Luke Skywalker?
Something, yeah. Well, we didn't get a Star Wars reference in the last episode, did we? Shame on us. I don't see that in the Bible, that phrase. So it leads me to think that's not a thing. There's a difference between a shut-in or someone, their heart being with us, our heart being with them. When we're talking about actual worship, and particularly the Lord's Supper, there's no reference of someone being not there, but being a part of it still and doing it in spirit. Would you agree? Or, am I not finding the right passage?
1 Corinthians 5:3, absent in body, but present in spirit. No, that's...
So are we also going to add that to the list of scriptures taken out of context, like where 2 or more are gathered in his name?
Well, if we're going to get into it, Hebrews 10:24 and 25 is actually talking about completely abandoning the faith altogether. Not just bad attendance.
It's important. We need to probably have one of those episodes where we talk about all the scriptures. Yeah, straight out of context. I love that bulletin you had a while back. I made it look like
a little bit edgy.
I made it look like straight out of Compton, on the page there, but straight out of context. It's all the verses that we use out of context. But specifically, this is the one in Matthew is done a lot, where 2 or more are gathered in His name, and we're here in spirit, or we're here worshiping. That's about discipline. That's about church discipline. It's not about attendance. I've heard people use that for a lot of other reasons.
Being said, when you get a bunch of Christians together on a Sunday morning, singing praises together, worshiping Him, and you're singing a song that your heart is feeling and being touched by, you do feel the presence of the Lord in our midst. Put that passage aside for a minute. It is something that you experience that's unique, that you can only really experience together in worship.
I think we can take this topic and even extend it beyond just the Lord's Day. If I could make a quick comparison here, there's a story in Luke chapter 4 where Jesus goes to the synagogue and reads a scripture and tells them it's been fulfilled in their time, right in front of them, in Jesus Himself. Now, they didn't accept it, but the point I want to make is the verse that leads up to it in Luke chapter 4. In verse 16, he says that He came to Nazareth where He had been brought up, and as His custom was, He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. I would ask you to look in the Old Testament and find me the verse where regular attendance on the Sabbath at a synagogue is commanded by God. It's not there. I'll just spoil it. It's not there. But what I learned from this is Jesus looked at something that it wasn't necessarily commanded by God, but it's a good thing to do. And it's related. It correlates to the Sabbath, which is commanded by God, and it's a good practice. Where I'm going with this is Wednesday. We have Bible class every Wednesday at our church, as many churches do throughout the week. In fact, we have other opportunities to gather on a regular basis and study. You could even look at the work groups that we're going to be doing at this church here. There are lots of opportunities outside of Sunday. Well, I can't find a Bible verse that says I have to go on Wednesdays. True. But I could look to the example of Jesus, and he looked at the Sabbath and going to the synagogue and reading the scriptures as a good thing to do. And that was his custom. Going to Bible class on Wednesday, could you really tell me that that's not a good way to spend your evening? That's a good custom.
And going to a football game to support a player that you know, going to a funeral to support the family that lost a loved one. We all understand these opportunities where we show up to show support, and we show up and avail ourselves of any time that we can do that. Whether it's home Bible studies, it's group meetings. I mean, I would agree is, where's your heart focused? Are you trying to avail yourself and be there for God, for any opportunity to study his word, to focus on him, to meet with other brethren? And
we're all going to have those scheduling conflicts where it's like, what do I do? Do I go to Bible class? Do I go to this thing? We're all going to have those come up from time to time, and we're going to have to make our best decisions. But I would hope this is our custom. For me in high school, every Wednesday was the track meet.
Yeah.
And I could go, and I got special permission from my coach to leave the meet early after my event was done. And I'd go to Bible class. I'd change in the car or wear my tracksuit to Bible class. And as a kid, I would always ask my dad when a basketball game would happen, can I skip Bible class and go? And he would always say no. I kept asking him throughout my childhood. At some point, I don't know if this was like intentional, part of my dad's plan as a father from the beginning, or just as I got older, as a teenager, I was baptized. And he finally, just one time I asked him, said, I think you're old enough to decide for yourself. Do you think you should go to this game or go to Bible class? And a couple of times I chose the game or the thing or whatever, not that often, but every time my dad let me choose and I chose to do something other than Bible class, I felt bad about it. And eventually I just stopped asking my dad, and I would just choose Bible class on my own.
Yeah, your conscience was being developed. And my family did the same thing, and I plan on doing the same thing with my kids. At some point in time, you're demanding or you're forcing your kids to go to church shifts into not allowing them to just to make the decision, but putting it on them and asking them, well, what do you think? Do you think this is more important than Bible class? And giving them that opportunity to focus on the decisions that they make, because it definitely develops the conscience and the focus of prioritization in God's word. The great thing about talking in a podcast about this is when you do sermons on this, you're preaching to the choir, right? Is what we say. You're preaching to people who are there, who are in the attendance. That's why you do this on Sunday mornings, right? You get a higher attendance. But at the end of the day, this is great that we're having this discussion. And there's some days where it's difficult, or you say, am I really sick? My back hurts or something, or a kid has an event, or we have to then sit there and weigh, which is more important? Should we do one or the other? And how can we make accommodations? And it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to do as a parent, let alone an adult. But we are talking about priority on the majority. Where are you going to come down to? And are you focusing on worship and these opportunities and seeking first all the opportunities you have to worship God and to develop those relationships with your brethren?
I would just say this, a local congregation is only as strong as its members. And so if you're listening to this and you look at yourself as a member, if the church's strength was based on your attendance, how strong would it appear? If it was all up to you, I don't know if you have seen other congregations over the years, and you see some churches that have literally gone from hundreds to closing their doors. And you wonder, what happened? How did it get to this point? And the congregation any congregation that I'm part of, all I want to say is not on my watch. If I'm involved, I want to make sure we are engaged. We're doing everything we possibly can. And I can't control everybody else, but I can control what I do. And I don't want to ever do anything to weaken this local body of Christians by just excluding myself when I probably could be there.
Well, excellent food for thought in this episode today. My final words are, if the idea of commitment doesn't sound appealing to you, just going, even if you don't want to, my advice to you is try it for a little bit. Take a month, and I'm going to go no matter what. I'm going to go every Sunday, every Wednesday, every Bible class. I'm going to go to every opportunity. Don't overdo it, but just try that. And I think the commitment will eventually turn into, you'll have that shift from making yourself go to, in times of crisis, I need to be there. It's what I need. And I think you'll see that shift, but it might take some commitment at first, but commitment will lead to those times of genuine desire to be there.
Well, thank you both for this discussion today. And thank you for listening. You know, John, you brought up Hebrews chapter 10, verses 24 and 25, and how sometimes that can be used out of context. We focus in on forsaking the assemblies, and we kind of focus in on that. But really, that verse is about encouragement. And it says, let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works. Then it says, not forsaking our own assembling together. If you want to be encouraging to each other, one of the things I'll just end with is the attitude that we come to services with. And so I agree with Kyle, great point. Just try it. Be here, but don't just be here. And maybe a future episode could be an attender versus a member. If you really want to be engaged, come with your notebook and really engage in what's taking place. Listen closely to the sermon. How can you do better to be prepared? In the Bible class, if you've read ahead so that you're coming and it's so much more meaningful by what you're putting into it. We've heard teachers say that. Do that yourself. But most importantly, be engaged with the brothers and sisters that are around you. Get to know people. Talk to people you've never talked to so that when you're here, it's more meaningful. Faith is a team sport. And so if you're listening to this and your attendance has not been what it should be, let's encourage you to be there more often, and we'd love to see you. And if you ever think you're not missed, you are. And so we love you. We'd love to see you more. And with that, we'll plan to see you here next time on the Exhorter podcast. Thank you.
Showing up in seat warming reminds me of that. I'm forcing, this is a forced Star Wars bit right here, but you know, an intelligent life conversation there that Jar Jar has with Qui-Gon. You know, I spake. You know, I showed up.
The ability to speak does not make one.
Yeah, the ability to show up. Next time, the ability to show up and seat warm does not make you a member.
Or the Star Wars reference I always think of is when I go to the elders meetings. You know, we grant you a position on this council, but we do not grant you the rank of elder. How can this be?
It's unfair.
We feed you, but no vote.